everybody, it's Susan. Welcome to my channel, Susan Diamond Paint. February 7th devotional, Luke 6:36. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. It's called A Lost Lady. This is part 1, chapter 1. 30 or 40 years ago, in one of those gray towns along the Burlington Railroad, which are so much grayer today than they were then, there was a house well known from Omaha to Denver for its hospitality and for a certain charm of atmosphere. Well known, that is to say, to the railroad aristocracy of that time, men who had to do with the railroad itself or with one of the land companies which were its byproducts. In those days, it was enough to say of a man that he was connected with the Burlington. There were the directors, the general managers, vice presidents, superintendents, whose names we all knew, and their younger brothers or nephews were auditors, freight agents, departmental assistants. Everyone connected with the road, even the large cattle and grain shippers, had annual passes. They and their families rode over the line a great deal. There were then two distinct social strata in the prairie states: the homesteaders and handworkers who were there to make a living, and the bankers and gentlemen ranchers who came from the Atlantic seaboard to invest money and to develop our great West, as they used to tell us. When the Burlington men were traveling back and forth on business, not very urgent, they found it agreeable to drop off the express and spend a night in a pleasant house where their importance was delicately recognized. And no house was pleasanter than that of Captain Daniel Forrester, at Sweetwater. Captain Forrester himself, a railroad man, a contractor, who had built hundreds of miles of road for the Burlington over the sagebrush and cattle country and on up into the Black Hills. The Forrester place, as everyone called it, was not at all remarkable. The people who lived there made it seem much larger and finer than it was. The house stood on a low round hill nearly a mile east of town, a white house with a wing and a sharp sloping roof to shed the snow. It was encircled by porches too narrow for modern notions of comfort, supported by the fussy, fragile pillars of that time, when every honest stick of timber was tortured by the turning lath into something hideous. Stripped of its vines and denuded of its shrubbery, the house probably would have been ugly enough. It stood close into a fine cottonwood grove that threw sheltering arms to left and right and grew all down the hillside behind it. Thus placed on the hill against its bristling grove, it was the first thing one saw coming into Sweetwater by rail, and the last thing one saw on departing. To approach Captain Forrester's property, you had to first get over a wide sandy creek which flowed along the eastern edge of the town. Crossing this by the footbridge or the ford, you entered the captain's private lane, bordered by Lombardy pollers, which wide meadows lying on either side. Just at the foot of the hill on which the house sat, one crossed a second creek by the stout wooden road bridge. This stream traced artless loops and curves through the broad meadows that were half pasture land, half marsh. Anyone but Captain Forrester would have drained the bottom land and made it into highly productive fields, but he had selected this place long ago because it looked beautiful to him, and he happened to like the way the creek wound through his pasture, with mint and joint grass and twinkling willows along its banks. He was well off for those times, and he had no children. He could afford to humor his fancies. When the captain drove friends from Omaha or Denver over from the station in his Democrat wagon, it gratified him to hear these gentlemen admire his fine stock, grazing the mows on either side of his lane. And when they reached the top of the hill, it gratified him to see men who were older than himself leap nimbly to the ground and run up the front steps as Mrs. Forrester came out onto the porch to greet them. Even the hardest and coldest of his friends, a certain narrow-faced Lincoln banker, became animated when he took her hand, tried to meet the gay challenge in her eyes, and to reply cleverly to the droll word of greeting on her lips. She was always there, just outside the front door, to welcome their visitors, having been warned of their approach by the sound of hoofs and the rumble of wheels on the wooden bridge. If she happened to be in the kitchen helping her bohemian cook, she came out in her apron, waving a buttery iron spoon, or shook cherry-stained fingers at her new arrival. She never stopped to pin up a lock. She was attractive and dishable, and she knew it. She had been known to rush to the door in her dressing gown, brush in hand, and her long black hair rippling over her shoulders, to welcome Cyrus Dalzell, president of the Colorado and Utah, and that great man had never felt more flattered. In his eyes, and in the eyes of the miry middle-aged men who visited there, whatever Mrs. Forrester chose to do was ladylike because she did it. They could not imagine her in any dress or situation in which she would not be charming. Captain Forrester himself, a man of few words, told Judge Pomeroy that he had never seen her look more captivating than on the day when she was chased by the new bull in the pasture. She had forgotten about the bull and gone into the meadow to gather wild flowers. He heard her scream, and as he ran puffing down the hill, she was scuttling along the edge of the marshes like a hare, beside herself with laughter, and stubbornly clinging to the crimson parasol that had made all the trouble. Mrs. Forrester was 25 years younger than her husband, and she was his second wife. He married her in California and brought her to Sweetwater a bride. They called the place home even then when they lived there but a few months out of each year. But later, after the captain's terrible fall with his horse in the mountains, which broke him so that he could no longer build railroads, he and his wife retired to the house on the hill. He grew old there, and even she, alas, grew older. Chapter 2. But we will begin the story with a summer morning long ago when Mrs. Forrester was still a young woman, and Sweetwater was a town of which great things were expected. That morning she was standing in the deep bay window of her parlor, arranging old-fashioned blush roses in a glass bowl. Glancing up, she saw a group of little boys coming along the driveway, barefoot, with fishing poles and lunch baskets. She knew most of them. There was Neil Herbert, Judge Pomeroy's nephew, a handsome boy of 12, whom she liked, and polite George Adams, son of a gentleman rancher from Lowell, Massachusetts. The others were just little boys from the town, the butcher's red-headed son, the leading grocer's fat brown twins, Ed Elliott, whose flirtatious old father kept a shoe store and was the Don Juan of the lower world of Sweetwater, and the two sons of the German tailor, pale, freckled lads with ragged clothes and ragged, rusted-colored hair, from whom she sometimes bought game or catfish when they appeared silent and spook-like at her kitchen door and thinly asked if she would care for any fish this morning. As the boys came up the hill, she saw them hesitate and consult together. "You ask her, Neil." "You better, George. She goes to your house all the time, and she barely knows me to speak to." As they paused before the 3 steps which led up to the front porch, Miss Forrester came to the door and nodded graciously, one of the pink roses in her hand. "Good morning, boys. Off for a picnic?" George Adams stepped forward and solemnly took off his big straw hat. "Good morning, Mrs. Forrester. Please, may we fish and wade down in the marsh and have our lunch in the grove?" "Certainly. You have a lovely day. How long has school been out? Don't you miss it?" "I'm sure Neil does. Judge Pomeroy tells me he's very studious." The boys laughed, and Neil looked unhappy. "Run along. Be sure you don't leave the gate into the pasture open. Mr. Forrester hates to have the cattle get in his bluegrass." The boys went quietly around the house to the gate into the grove, their men shouting down the grassy slopes under the tall trees. Mrs. Forrester watched them from the kitchen window until they disappeared behind the roll of the hill. She turned to her bohemian cook. "Mary, when you are baking this morning, put in a pan of cookies for those boys. I'll take them down when they are having their lunch." The round hill on which the Forrester house stood sloped gently down to the bridge in front and gently down through the grove behind. But east of the house, where the grove ended, it broke steeply from high grassy banks like bluffs to marsh below. It was thither the boys were bound. When lunchtime came, they had done none of the things they were meant to do. They had behaved like wild creatures all morning, shouting from the breezy bluffs, dashing down into the silvery marsh through the dewy cobwebs that glistened on the tall weeds, swishing among the pale tan cattails, wading in the sandy creek bed, chasing a striped water snake from the old willow stump where he was sunning himself, cutting slingshot crotches, throwing themselves on their stomachs to drink the cool spring that flowed out from under a bank into a thatch of dark watercress. Only the 2 German boys, Reinhold and Adolf Blum, withdrew to a still pool where the creek was dammed by a reclining tree trunk, and in spite of all the noise and splashing about them, managed to catch a few suckers. The wild roses were wide open and brilliant. The blue-eyed grass was in purple flower, and the silvery milkweed was just coming in. Birds and butterflies darted everywhere. All at once the breeze died, the air grew very hot, and the marsh steamed, and the birds disappeared. The boys found that they were tired. Their shirts stuck to their bodies, and their hair to their foreheads. They left the sweltering marsh meadows for the grove, lay down on clean grass under the grateful shade of the tall cottonwoods, and spread out their lunch. The Blum boys never brought anything but rye bread and hunks of dry cheese. Their companions wouldn't have touched it on any account, but Thaddeus Grimes, the butcher's red-headed son, was the only one impolite enough to show his scorn. "You live on weenies to home. Why don't you ever bring none?" he bawled. "Hush," said Neil Herbert. He pointed to a white figure coming rapidly down through the grove under the flickering leaf shadows. Mrs. Forrester, bareheaded, a basket on her arm, her blue-black hair shining in the sun. It was not until years afterward that she began to wear veils and sun hats, though her complexion was never one of her beauties. Her cheeks were pale and rather thin, slightly freckled in the summer. As she approached, George Adams, who had a particular mother, rose, and Neil followed his example. "Here are some hot cookies for your lunch, boys." She took the napkin off the basket. "Did you catch anything?" "We didn't fish much, just ran about," said George. "I know, you were waiting and things." She had a nice way of talking to boys, light and confidential. "I wade down there myself sometimes when I go down to get flowers. I can't resist it. I pull off my stockings and pick up my skirts, and in I go." She thrust out a white shoe and shook it. "But you can swim, can't you, Mrs. Forrester?" said George. "Most women can't." "Oh, yes, they can. In California, everybody swims. But the sweet water doesn't tempt me. Mud and water snakes and bloodsuckers. Ugh," she shivered, laughing. "We seen a water snake this morning and chased him. A whopper," Thad Grimes put in. "Why didn't you kill him? Next time I go wading, he'll bite my toes." "Now go on with your lunch. George can leave the basket with Mary as you go out." She left him, and they watched her white figure drifting along the edge of the grove as she stopped here and there to examine the raspberry vines by the fence. "These are good cookies, all right," said one of the giggly brown Weaver twins. The German boys munched in silence. They were all rather pleased that Mrs. Forrester had come down to them herself instead of sending Mary. Even rough little Thad Grimes, with his red thatch and catfish mouth, the characteristic feature of all the Grimeses' room, knew that Mrs. Forrester was a very special kind of person. George and Neil were already old enough to see for themselves that she was different from the other townswomen, and to reflect upon what it was that made her so. The Blum brothers regarded her humbly from under their pale, chewed-off hair as one of the rich and great of the world. They realized more than their companions that such a fortunate and privileged class was an axiomatic fact in the social order. The boys had finished their lunch and were lying on the grass talking about how Judge Pomeroy's water spaniel, Fanny, had been poisoned and who had actually done it, when they had a second visitor. "Shut up, boys. There he comes now. That's Poison Ivy," said one of the Weaver twins. "Shut up. We don't want old Roger poisoned." A well-grown boy of 18 or 19, dressed in shabby corduroy hunting suit, with a gun and a game bag, had climbed up from the marsh and was coming down the grove between the row of trees. He walked with a rude, arrogant stride, kicking at twigs, and carried himself with unnatural erectness, as if he had a steel rod down his back. There was something defiant and suspicious about the way he held his head. He came up to the group and addressed them in a superior, patronizing tone. "Hello, kids. What are you doing here?" "Picnic," said Ed Elliott. "I thought girls went on picnics. Did you bring Teacher along? Ain't you kids old enough to hunt yet?" George Adams looked at him scornfully. "Of course we are. I got a .22 Remington for my last birthday, but we know better to bring guns over here. You better hide yours, Mr. Ivy, or Mrs. Forrester will come down and tell you to get out. She can't see us from the house, and anyhow, she can't say anything to me. I'm just as good as she is." To this the boys made no reply. Such an assertion was absurd even to fish-mouthed Thad. His father's business depended upon some people being better than others and ordering better cuts of meat in consequence. If everyone ate round steak like Ivy Peters' family, they would be nothing in the butcher's trade. The visitor put his gun and game bag behind a tree, however, and stood stiffly upright, surveying the group out of his narrow, beady eyes and making them all uncomfortable. George and Neil hated to look at Ivy, and yet his face had a kind of fascination for them. It was red, and the flesh looked hard, as if it were swollen from bee stings, or from an encounter with poison ivy. This nickname, however, was given him because it was well known that he had made away with several other dogs before he poisoned the judge's friendly water spaniel. Boys said he took a dislike to a dog and couldn't rest until he made an end of him. Ivy's red skin was flecked with tiny freckles like rust spots, and in each of his hard cheeks there was a curling indentation, like a knot in a tree hole, 2 permanent dimples which did anything but soften his countenance. His eyes were very small, and absence of eyelashes gave his pupils the fixed, unblinking hardness of a snake's or lizard's. His hands had the same swollen look as his face, and were deeply creased across the back and knuckles, as if the skin were stretched too tight. He was an ugly fellow, Ivy Peters, and he liked being ugly. He began telling the boys that it was too hot to hunt now, but later he meant to steal down to the marsh where the ducks came at sundown and bag a few. I can make off across the cornfields before the old Cap sees me. He is not much on the run. He'll complain to your father. Oh, whoop, my father cares. The speaker's restless eyes were looking up through the branches. See that woodpecker tapping? Don't mind us a bit. That's nerve. They're protected here, so they're not afraid, said a precise George. They spoil the old man's grove for him. The tree's full of holes already. Wouldn't he come down easy now? Neil and George Adams sat up. Don't you dare shoot here. You'll get us all in trouble. She'd come right from the house, cried Ed Elliott. Let her come. Stuck up a piece. Who's talking about shooting anyway? There's more ways of killing dogs than choking them with butter. At this effrontery, the boys shot amazed glances at one another, and the Brown Weaver twins broke simultaneously into giggles and rolled over on the turf. But Ivy seemed unaware that he was being regarded as being especially resourceful where dogs were concerned. He drew from his pocket a metal slingshot and some round bits of gravel. I won't kill it. I'll just surprise it, so we can have a look at it. Bet you won't hit it. Bet I will. He fitted the stone to the leather, squinted, and let it fly. Sure enough, the woodpecker dropped at his feet. He threw his heavy black felt hat over it. Ivy never wore a straw hat, even in the hottest weather. Now wait, he'll come to. You'll hear him flutter in a minute. It ain't a he anyhow, it's a female. Anybody would know that, Neil said contemptuously, annoyed that this unpopular boy should come along and spoil their afternoon. He held the fate of his uncle's spaniel against Ivy Peters. All right, Miss Female, said Ivy carelessly, intent upon a project of his own. He took from his pocket a little red leather box, and when he opened it, the boy saw that it contained curious little instruments. A tiny sharp knife blades, hooks, curved needles, a saw, a blowpipe, and scissors. Some of these I got with a taxidermy outfit from the youth's companion, and some I made myself. He got stiffly down on his knees, his joints seemed disciplined to bend at all, and listened beside his hat. She's as lively as a cricket, he announced. Thrusting his hand suddenly under the brim, he brought out the startled bird. It was not bleeding, it did not seem to be crippled. Now you watch, and I'll show you something, said Ivy. He held the woodpecker's head in a vise made of his thumb and forefinger, enclosing its panting body with his palm. Quick as a flash, as if it was a practiced trick, with one of those tiny blades, he slit both the eyes that glared in the bird's stupid little head and instantly released it. The woodpecker rose in the air with a whirling corkscrew motion, darted to the right, struck a tree trunk, to the left, struck another. Up and down, backward, forward, among the tangle of branches it flew, raking its feathers, falling and recovering itself. The boys stood watching it, indignant and uncomfortable, not knowing what to do. They were not especially sensitive. Thad was always on hand when there was anything doing at the slaughterhouse, and the Blum boys lived by killing things. They wouldn't have believed that they could be so upset by a hurt woodpecker. There was something wild and desperate about the way the darkened creature beat its wings in the branches, whirring in the sunlight, and never seeing it, always thrusting its head upon and shaking it, as a bird does when it's drinking. Presently it managed to get its feet on the same limb where it had been struck, and seemed to recognize that perch. As if it had learned something by its bruises, it pecked and crept its way along the branch and disappeared into its own hole. There, Neil Herbert explained between his teeth. If I can get it now, I can kill it and put it out of its misery. Lay me on your back, Rain. Reinhold was the tallest, and he obediently bent his bony back. The trunk of the cottonwood tree is hard to climb. The bark is rough, and the branches begin a long way up. Neil tore his trousers and scratched his bare legs smartly before he got to the first fork. After recovering breath, he wound his way up toward the woodpecker's hole, which was inconveniently high. He was almost there. His companions below thought him quite safe, when he suddenly lost his balance, turned a somersault in the air, and bumped down on the grass at their feet. There he lay without moving. "Run for water! Run for Miss Forrester! Ask her for whiskey!" "No," said George Adams, "let's carry him up to the house. She'll know what to do." "That's sense," said Ivy Peters. As he was much bigger and stronger than any of the others, he lifted Neil's limp body and started up the hill. It had occurred to him that this would be a fine chance to get inside the Forresters' house and see what it was like, and this he had always wanted to do. Mary, the cook, saw them coming from the kitchen window and ran for her mistress. Captain Forrester was in Kansas City that day. Mrs. Forrester came to the back door. "What's happened? It's Neil, too. Bring him in this way, please." Ivy Peters followed her, keeping his eyes open. The rest trooped after him, all but the Blum boys, who knew that their place was outside the kitchen door. Mrs. Forrester led the way through the butler's pantry, the dining room, the back parlor, to her own bedroom. She threw down the white counterpane, and Ivy laid Neil upon the sheets. Mrs. Forrester was concerned but not frightened. "Mary, will you bring him the brandy from the sideboard? George, telephone Dr. Dennison to come over at once. Now you other boys run out on the front porch and wait quietly. There are too many of you in here." She knelt by the bed, putting brandy between Neil's white lips with a teaspoon. The little boys withdrew. Only Ivy Peters remained standing in the back parlor just outside the bedroom door, his arms folded across his chest, taking in his surroundings with bold, unblinking eyes. Mrs. Forrester glanced at him over her shoulder. "Will you wait on the porch, please? You're older than the others, and if anything is needed, I can call on you." Ivy cursed himself, but he had to go. There was something final about her imperious courtesy. High and mighty, he called it. He had intended to sit down in the biggest leather chair and cross his legs and make himself at home, but he found himself on the front porch, put out by that deftly modulated voice as effectually as if he had been kicked out by the brawniest tough in town. Neil opened his eyes and looked wonderingly about the big half-darkened room full of heavy, old-fashioned walnut furniture. He was lying on a wet bed with ruffled pillow shams, and Mrs. Forrester was kneeling beside him, bathing his forehead with cologne. Bohemian Mary stood behind her with a basin of water. "Ouch, my arm," he muttered, and the perspiration broke out on his face. "Yes, dear, I'm afraid it's broken. Don't move. Dr. Denson will be here in a few minutes. It doesn't hurt very much, does it?" "No," he said faintly. He was in pain, but he felt weak and contented. The room was cool and dusky and quiet. At his house, everything was hard when one was sick. What soft fingers Miss Forrester had, and what a lovely lady she was. Inside the lace ruffle of her dress, he saw her white throat rising and falling so quickly. Suddenly she got off to take off her glittering rings. She had not thought of them before, shed them off her fingers with a quick motion as if she was washing her hands, and dropped them into Mary's broad palm. The little boy was thinking that he would probably never be in so nice a place again. The windows went almost down to the baseboard like doors, and the closed green shutters let in streaks of sunlight that quivered on the polished floor and the silver things on the dresser. The heavy curtains were looped back with thick cords like ropes. The marble-topped washstand was as big as a sideboard. The massive walnut furniture was inlaid with pale-colored woods. Neil had a scroll saw, and this inlay interested him. "There, he looks better now, doesn't he, Mary?" Mrs. Forrester ran her fingers through his black hair and lightly kissed him on the forehead. Oh, how sweet she smelled. "Wheels on the bridge. It's Dr. Dennison. Go and show him in, Mary." Dr. Dennison set Neil's arm and took him home in his buggy. Home was not a pleasant place to go, a frail egg-shell house set off on the edge of the prairie where people of no consequence lived. Except for the fact that he was Judge Pomeroy's nephew, Neil would have been one of the boys to whom Mrs. Forrester merely nodded brightly as she passed. His father was a widower, a poor relation. A spinster from Kentucky kept house for them, and Neil thought she was probably the worst housekeeper in the world. Their house was usually full of washing in various stages of incompletion, tubs sitting about with linen soaking, and the beds were aired until any hour in the afternoon, with Cousin Sadie having to think of making them up. She liked to sit down after breakfast and read murder trials or pursue the well-worn copy of St. Elmo. Sadie was a good-natured thing and was always running off to help a neighbor, but Neil hated to have anyone come to see them. His father was at home very little, spent all his time in his office. He kept the county abstract books and made farm loans. Having lost his own property, he invested other people's money for them. He was a gentle, agreeable man, young, good-looking, with nice manners. But Neil felt that there was an air of failure and defeat about his family. He clung to his maternal uncle, Judge Pomeroy, white-whiskered and portly, who was Captain Forrester's lawyer and a friend of all the great men who visited the Forresters. Neil was proud like his mother. She died when he was 5 years old. She hated the West and used haughtily to tell her neighbors that she would never think of living anywhere but in Fayette County, Kentucky, that they had only come to Sweetwater to make investments and to turn the crown into the pound. By that phrase, she was still remembered, poor lady. And we'll stop there. So that was chapters 1 and 2. Okay, hope you enjoyed it. Talk with y'all later. Bye.